Okay, Eric, can you confirm that you can hear me? Okay, thank you. Welcome to Tackling Trachoma Endgame Challenges, a 2-year review of progress, outstanding, and new operations research questions. My name is Stephanie Palmer, and I'm the Trachoma Technical Advisor for USAID's ACT-END NTD's West program at FHI 360. My co-organizer is Jeremiah Ngundy, the Senior NTD Advisor for Trachoma at USAID's ACT-END NTD's East program at RTI International. I also want to especially acknowledge Eric Mosher for all his work in organizing this session, along with all the other speakers for their contributions. In 2020, Jeremiah, Eric, and I organized a session at Core NTD focusing on Trachoma Endgame Challenges related to reaching and maintaining the TF of less than 5% threshold, because a number of the countries in the USAID portfolio were caught in an MDA-TIS-MDA cycle, or would rebound to TF of greater than or equal to 5% at the Trachoma Surveillance Survey. So we wanted to understand whether other countries were also experiencing these challenges, and if so, how to overcome them. During that session, the participants came up with a list of needs to help tackle these challenges. Some of these needs are listed on this slide, but due to time constraints, I will not go into them. Since 2020, there has been rapid progress to help countries address these challenges. In the USAID portfolio, a deep dive was held to understand programmatic responses and the impact of these actions to lead to program improvements and understand whether some of the districts experiencing the MDA-TIS-MDA challenges may be because of issues beyond MDA delivery. Second, in December 2021, WHO convened an informal consultation on Trachoma Endgame Challenges. This meeting helped the trachoma community have a common understanding of the problem, definitions to use, and most importantly, laid out a path for countries to develop customized MDA and monitoring plans to reach the elimination thresholds. Finally, ITI and the Trachoma Expert Committee helped to operationalize these recommendations stemming from the WHO informal consultation by allowing countries to apply for the drug needed to implement more frequent than MDA strategies. In this meeting, we want to build on the discussions from 2020. There are still outstanding questions to help countries identify which districts may be at risk for persistent and recrudescent TF, and also in identifying whether the underlying issues are related to program delivery, imperfect diagnostics, statistical errors, or other reasons. The outcomes from the WHO informal consultation provide national programs with flexibility to design MDA strategies that will hopefully help them to reach and maintain TF of less than 5%. It also provides an opportunity for new OR, for example, related to which strategies are the most effective, feasible, acceptable, and affordable. Additionally, along with MDA implementation questions, other tools might be necessary to help countries monitor and make decisions based on better evidence moving forward. In today's session, Kristen Renneker, Senior Data Analyst at the International Trachoma Initiative, will lead us through the global picture of trachoma persistence and recrudescence. Dr. George Cabona, a Senior Eye Health Specialist who currently serves as the NTD Program Manager in the Ministry of Health of Tanzania, will describe the trachoma challenges in Tanzania and the strategies now being implemented based on the recommendations from the WHO informal consultation. Next, Diana Martin, the lead for the Integrated Serosurveillance Team at the Division of Parasitic Diseases at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, will talk about the usage of serology in monitoring areas with persistent and recrudescent trachoma. Clara Burgert-Brooker, an epidemiologist at RTI International, will then talk about geospatial analysis to identify areas of ongoing trachoma risk. And finally, Eric Mosher, Senior Technical Advisor in the Neglected Tropical Disease Branch of USAID, will remind us that if we are going to meet the 2030 elimination target, we need to examine other assumptions that we are making in program implementation and change our course where needed. Following these presentations, we will have 10 minutes of Q&A, and then we'll be split into breakout groups. And before we start, just a couple of housekeeping items. Please make sure to keep your microphones on mute in the plenary, even though the presentations have been pre-recorded. Second, right after the Q&A, we will be split into breakout groups, and there is likely to be a momentary period of limbo before you are placed in breakout groups. And then finally, during the breakout groups, OR questions and other salient discussion points will be recorded via Google Jamboards, and that link will be provided in the chat here. During the breakout groups, please also actively participate. We want your thoughts, OR questions, and anything else to help us move forward to reach trachoma elimination. And finally, before signing off, I just want to thank all our speakers, our rapporteurs, and all the participants who joined this session. Thank you. Kira and Mamadou, I think if you want to get started with the other presentations.
Guess we start.
Yeah, there should be pre-recorded audio. Hi everyone, my name is Kristen Reneker. I'm the Senior Data Analyst at ITI, and today I'll be presenting the snapshot of the distribution of persistent and recrudescent districts. In December 2021, a WHO informal consultation on Trachoma Endgame Challenges was held, where two categories eligible for modified strategies were agreed upon. The first is called persistence, and the definition of this is an implementation unit, or IU, with at least 2 impact surveys at which the TF prevalence is greater than or equal to 5%, without ever having had a TF prevalence less than 5%. And the second category is recrudescent, and this is an implementation unit with at least 1 surveillance survey at which the TF prevalence is greater than or equal to 5%. Here's a table of the persistent implementation units. All the data in this presentation is based on data in the global database as of August 29th, 2022. And in this table, you can see there are 10 countries meeting the definition of persistence. These are Ethiopia, Kenya, Mozambique, Niger, Nigeria, South Sudan, Sudan, Tanzania, Uganda, and Zambia. And in these countries, there are 1,372 IUs that were ever known to be endemic, of which 216 IUs meet the current definition of persistence, for a total of around 33 million people living in those persistent IUs. 22% of IUs in Ethiopia are persistent, although this does vary by region of Ethiopia. And around 83% of persistent IUs are in Ethiopia. So persistence is not solely an Ethiopia problem, but a majority of IUs meeting this definition are in Ethiopia. Here is a table of the recrudescent implementation units. There are 11 countries with at least 1 IU meeting the definition of recrudescent, and these are Cameroon, Chad, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya, Mozambique, Niger, Solomon Islands, Sudan, Tanzania, and Uganda. A total of 1,304 IUs in these countries were ever known to be endemic, of which 103 IUs are currently known to meet the definition of recrudescent, for a total of 12.7 million people living in these IUs. Just over half of all recrudescent IUs are in Ethiopia. Here's a map showing these data. Note that these are based on current survey results in the global database. We do acknowledge that there may be data outside of population-based prevalence surveys indicating whether trachoma is a public health problem, but for consistency, we're just using survey data here. So we've talked about what makes an IU eligible for a modified strategy, but what are some of the modified strategies? You can modify either your MDA strategy and or your monitoring strategies. The modified MDA strategies include increased frequency of MDA. This is when MDA rounds are closer together, or increased number of MDA rounds. This is when there are more total rounds, still around 12 months apart. And MDA rounds can also be modified to be targeted to certain populations, such as children. The modified monitoring strategies include enhanced investigation, program enhancement, collection of age-stratified infection and serological data, adapted TIS, adapted evaluation units, or remaining in surveillance, otherwise known as wait and see. Where are these modified strategies happening? So this is all based on information reported to ITI, but this table presents countries that have at least one persistent or recrudescent IU, and where there is a planned enhanced MDA, which is defined here as a modified MDA strategy presented at a tech meeting for either 2022 or 2023, and where countries are planning enhanced surveys and where those plans are confirmed or not yet confirmed. Thank you, and I'll be happy to answer questions during the Q&A portion of this session.
Hello everyone, my name is George Kabona. I am the National NTD Program Manager for Tanzania, and today I will show you how we revised the currently employed trachoma elimination strategies to be able to treat the persistent and recrudescent trachoma infection. Trachoma elimination program in Tanzania is very successful. Out of 77 districts which were ever endemic, we are now remaining with 10 districts, and the remaining 10 districts, they are either have persistent infection or recrudescence, and actually half of them have persistent, half of them have recrudescent disease. And if you look at the remaining territories, they display a regional pattern whereby the 9 remaining districts are all being concentrated in this region of Dodoma, Manyara, and Arusha. And there is also a cross-border migration of individuals between Kenya and Tanzania. The remaining district tells us the story is not the same because these communities are not responding to the standard approaches. Before reaching a point of developing and implementing modified strategies, we assessed the program delivery using a variety of methods, and through that we were able to identify many challenges. And here I will just show the key challenges which were identified. One of them is there was a moment of previous low MD coverage in those areas. And also these areas, they are predominantly with mobile and migrant populations. And there are some districts that showed there was an evidence of ongoing transmission and increasing prevalence of active trachoma. We also noticed that there was an associated low wash coverage in some areas. Now, following these findings, we adjusted and enhanced program delivery strategies through an iterative approach across multiple years to try to address these challenges. Despite all these efforts of addressing the challenges through the strengthening of program delivery, pockets of disease persist. A number of potential modified MDA and monitoring strategies were identified during the WHO informal consultation, which was conducted in December 2021, resulting in invitation from ITI and TEC to request additional these remarks for use in these areas. Now, using the lesson learned and the challenges identified through the previous program assessments, Tanzania developed the two approaches. And the first one is the more frequent than annual MDA in border districts of Longido and Ngorongoro. These are the areas that have programmatic complexities such as nomadic interpastoralist communities and also low wash coverages. We elected to do so, the biannual MDA, just to increase the probability of treating everyone at least once and hopefully twice. We also pair it with the enhanced program delivery and monitoring, with emphasis being on micro-planning and tailored behavioral change and communication, and also adapted impact assessment to include the chlamydia trachomatis infection and serology assessment, and also account for migratory population. In the remaining 80 districts, we elected to conduct 2 additional annual rounds of MDA with the aim of increasing antibiotic pressure and also give additional time to ourselves to focus on F&E component of the surface strategies in order to sustain the reduction in transmission when it's achieved. We will also conduct the regional synchronized MDA paired with the programmatic delivery enhancement and monitoring. This diagram provides a summary of what I just said. MDA rounds under current guideline are shown in orange circles, and the additional MDA rounds that have been modified are shown in all other colors. We recently finished cross-border MDA between Kenya and Tanzania, which involved the district of Longido and Ngorongoro on the Tanzanian side and Narok and Kajiado on the Kenyan side. We also completed an additional annual rounds in the district of Chamwino and Kongwa, both of which were due for impact surveys, but we chose to continue with the MDA instead. While we are in the early stages of implementation, we can take lessons learned from the first round of MDA and apply to planning and operationalization of biannual MDA, which is underway. We identified a number of lessons learned, and they are all important, but key among them include the importance of planning and micro-planning for the successful implementation of the new strategies. We also highlighted the importance of engaging local leaders throughout all phases of planning, implementation, and supervision. This will increase the community accountability. Now, looking ahead, we need to build in flexibility and responsiveness to findings from planning, monitoring, and evaluation, and also take lessons learned from after actual review and apply immediately to the next round of implementation. This is the piloting phase, and thinking in the future for scaling up, we have the limited resources in terms of time, funding, and people, and therefore we need to consider what data or indicators can be used to select the most appropriate strategies while maximizing the impact. To monitor and evaluate modified strategies, during MDA we do the enhanced supervision and also use the electronic data capture to assess the coverage. After the MDA, we conducted the after action review and also the enhanced coverage evaluation surveys. We are also planning to conduct the qualitative assessment for acceptability of these new strategies. And the long term, we'll assess the efficacy of modified approaches by looking at impact on trachoma follicles, chlamydia infection, and storage, and adapting survey design to account for mobile population. Thank you for listening.
Hello, my name is Diana Martin. I am from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and I'll be talking today about alternative indicators for districts with persistent and recrudescent trachoma and support for programs. The indicators we'll be discussing today are TF, the standard indicator to make decisions to start or stop MDA, infection, in which we look for the presence of the bacteria from ocular swabs by detection of nucleic acid, typically using PCR, and antibody tests or serology testing, in which we're looking for antibodies in the blood. Because antibody testing is a little less familiar to some people, I wanted to show the working hypothesis for this, in which the prevalence of antibodies in children can provide historical information about exposure and therefore transmission intensity. And we look at this through age seroprevalence curves, so looking at age in the x-axis on these graphs, seroprevalence on the y-axis, and then we're comparing a pre and post MDA cross-section of the same communities. And you can see the flattening of the curve after MDA, especially in the younger ages, indicating changes in transmission over time. The tests we're using, many of these are developed in my lab at CDC over the past 10 years. We have a multiplex bead assay, an ELISA, and a lateral flow assay. We have used these in a number of population-based surveys with a number of partners to validate that the tests are essentially interchangeable for use to whichever the programs choose to use. And so in this instance, we're working with the Carter Center and the Amhara Regional Health Bureau in Ethiopia, looking at 2 districts that had received more than 7 rounds of MDA, Alefa and Andebet. And at this impact survey, Alefa was below 5% and Andebet was still at 37%. You can see the stark differences in the shapes of the curves in Alefa and Andebet, where it's relatively flat, where there's little TF and no infection, but increasing seroprevalence with age between the ages of 1 and 9 years. In Andebet, where TF is 37% and infection is 11.3%. You can also see the consistency between the different types of serological tests used. And so this data then demonstrates that in Andebet, trachoma is still a public health problem. In Kiribati, on the island of Tarawa, TF, infection, and serology indicators were all quite high and indicating trachoma as a public health problem. And I've represented the agreement and the indicators in this solid triangle. In contrast, in Vanuatu, TF was quite high, but infection and serology indicators were rather low, indicated here by the discordance in the colors on this triangle. And these data, along with other clinical and epidemiological data, were used to support Vanuatu's dossier for elimination of trachoma as a public health problem. We have a number of ongoing studies in areas of uncertain TF. In one example, in Cote d'Ivoire, at baseline, there was uncertain TF due to other epidemiological data. And so infection and serology were used in resurveys there in 2 districts, which is being presented at ASTMH. There's a number of other countries with persistent TF in particular. I mentioned Ethiopia already, and then already some with recrudescent TF, in which tropical data is helping to support infection and serology testing in those areas as part of their trachoma surveys. And so tropical data is working with partners to add serology and infection testing as an option as part of the routine service they provide in support of these multi-indicator surveys. And this will encompass from protocol development through data interpretation and dissemination, and will adhere to the tropical data principles described here. In further support of countries wanting to use alternative indicators, UCSF is leading a meta-analysis of a number of different surveys in which TF data, infection, and serology have all been collected to better understand what thresholds for serology and PCR associate with trachoma not being a public health problem. So here they're showing data from a number of studies, excuse me, with serology on the left, PCR on the right, and showing agreement between these indicators. And Christine De Dejanto will talk about this at ASTMH. And then finally, we have begun the guideline development process for serology tests following the guideline development handbook from WHO, and some of you may have already been invited to be part of this guideline development group. So I'll end here, and I want to thank all of our partners, many I've mentioned throughout the talk, and many others, in particular the various ministries of health who have included alternative indicators as part of their surveys and have contributed data to the large meta-analyses. Thanks very much.
Hello, my name is Clara Berger-Brucker. I'm an epidemiologist at RTI International and a PhD candidate at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Today I'll be speaking about my research looking at the use of spatial analysis tools to identify areas of ongoing risk of trachoma. The key research question that I'll be addressing today is, can geospatial tools help identify zones of concern that have persistent or recrudescent trachoma risk, which may warrant further survey or operational research follow-up activities? In the examples I will discuss today, trachoma is measured as trachomatous inflammation follicular in 1 to 9-year-olds, or TF for short. Today I'll review 4 potential approaches to answer the overarching research question. Those approaches vary in level of difficulty and the skills needed to conduct the analysis and the types of decision-making tools that are final outputs. Approach 1 analyzes historic program data at the subunit level to better understand the distribution of trachoma prevalence. The analysis visualizes the data from survey results along with historic coverage data. The goal is to understand the relationship between TF prevalence and MDA coverage and to think beyond the evaluation unit or EU boundaries to potentially split or redesign EUs that are more similar. The question that you might try to answer with this approach is, are there different ways to group subunits to create new EUs that have more similar historic data? For an applied example, in this map, we see the prevalence of TF from a trachoma survey in 10.1, whose overall EU prevalence was above the 5% threshold and needs to continue MDA. And in the purple map, the results of the MDA coverage that occurred after the survey. We combine the two maps to see how this data is related. For the next survey, we might suggest that this EU be split in two, with EU1 with higher coverage and lower prevalence, and EU2 with higher prevalence and lower coverage. Approach 2 looks to identify areas with higher risk profiles using geospatial covariate data. A recent systematic review published in PLOS NTD looked to answer the question if there are certain community or environmental factors associated with higher trachoma prevalence in the published literature. Results from the review shown here in the evidence map indicates that areas with less precipitation, lower temperatures, lower altitude, less accessibility, less medical services, less school access, and areas with less water and sanitation access, as well as more rural areas, are all associated with increased TF prevalence. This information can be used to build a profile for areas at risk of trachoma in a country and also to inform the covariates used in Approach 4. Approach 3 looks to identify localized areas of trachoma risk. The approach uses spatial analysis tools to identify localized distribution of TF prevalence in an area of interest. The key question that this method is trying to answer is if there is continued higher TF in the same area at different time points, and thus might we expect to find TF in that same place in the future. Continuing the applied example from earlier, we now have a second survey time point with prevalence data. This last map overlays the data from time point 1 and time point 2. The spatial analysis has identified 2 areas with clustering of higher prevalence over time, shown within the green circles. These zones of concern might indicate areas where further investigation is needed, along with potentially enhanced programmatic support. Finally, Approach 4 is to create modeled prevalence maps using current available survey data points and geospatial covariates to estimate the current prevalence in a location. The difference between approach 3 and 4 is that in approach 4, we estimate current prevalence across a whole area, not just where the survey was conducted. The key research question is if there are areas of concern with high prevalence that need further investigation. To continue our example, we have the map of prevalence data from the 2 survey points that we used in approach 3, and also in green, the map of estimated percentage of households with safe water access, an example covariate. Now, if we create a modeled map surface of the prevalence data using covariate data to augment our modeling, we could identify areas of concern in which we might conduct targeted sampling or other programmatic activities. When thinking about these 4 approaches to looking at trachoma data in the areas of persistent and recrudescent trachoma, I have thought of some additional research questions, which I hope we can expand on in our discussion today. What type, format of decision-making tools are most useful for decision makers? How can thinking beyond the EU borders be applied more routinely when creating EUs for future surveys? What spatial covariates are specifically associated with trachoma in specific countries? And finally, what prevalence area, size, number of clusters, and in what time frame delineates a zone of concern? Funding for this research is from RTI's Internal Strategic Investment Fund that complements the USAID Act to End NT East program. Many individuals make this research possible, including most importantly, the trachoma endemic communities and their country ministries of health, along with trachoma survey teams and survey respondents. And finally, I'd like to thank my PhD supervisors, Emma Harding-Esch and Anthony Solomon, and many other colleagues who support this work. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Mosier, and I am the trachoma focal person for the USAID's NTD division. After listening to the previous presenters, I think many would agree that despite a disruptive global pandemic, the Global Trachoma Program has not only shown great resilience, but also a rejuvenated dedication to finding solutions to challenges. Newly provided opportunities for modified MDA strategies and adapted survey methods might be the game changers needed to address persistent and recrudescent trachoma. Whereas it is important to celebrate breakthroughs like this, there is also a value in looking back to remember where we were. In 2020, myself, Dr. Jeremiah Ngandi with RTI International, and Stephanie Palmer with FHI 360, we were searching for a way to articulate our concern that a few but growing number of endemic districts were not responding as anticipated to the standard guidelines despite several rounds of and repeated cycles of MDA. With a bit of creativity and a dash of theatrics, at the 2020 Core NTD meeting, we developed and unveiled our representational concept of the Leaning Tower of Assumptions. The Leaning Tower of Assumptions is a visualization of the precariously balancing collection of assumptions that underpin the Global Elimination Program. The assumptions are grouped into 2 areas, those related to the targeting and delivery of MDA, and those related to measuring progress and goal attainment. Our theory is when all of these assumptions hold true and remain balanced, ministries of health are quickly able to leap over the progressive hurdles of MDA, progress measurement, goal sustainment, dossier development, and eventual validation. Where the assumptions don't hold up, critical balance is not achieved, and some districts are unable to move through these hurdles. Persistent and recrudescent districts are examples where assumptions don't hold up and typical program approaches do not work effectively. Following that core NTD meeting, energy seemed to be galvanized. The global community reviewed and defined what non-progressing or non-responding districts were and brought targeted attention to less stable assumptions through the outputs of the WHO informal consultation in late 2022. Ministries of health can now explore modified MDA strategies that will permit them to go beyond the original assumptions of a prescriptive fit between TF prevalences and rounds of MDA. Ministries of health are also strategically deploying the use of supervision coverage tools and coverage evaluation surveys to generate greater certainty around actual uptake of MDA. And ministries of health are exploring the casting of a wider net through synchronized MDA across borders to increase the likelihood of reaching mobile populations. Finally, ministries of health are also considering adaptive methods for impact and surveillance surveys to expand their abilities to capture program progress where populations are in flux. They are also considering the inclusion of additional indicators like serological and infection markers to assist with decision making. Regardless of our role, implementing partner, researcher, donor, we have all made the commitment to ministries of health to reach the elimination of trachoma as a public health problem, not just to try our best. So while there is great excitement about ongoing conversations and work to address some of these assumptions, we should ask ourselves, which of the others still require attention? For example, there are several assumptions related to our understanding of the underlying populations targeted. In particular, their stability over the course of MDA cycles, between MDA delivery and survey, and the 2-year period between impact and surveillance surveys. Could our programmatic assumptions that populations remain substantially the same be linked to our disappointment when thresholds for TF are not achieved or sustained? And there is the recrudescence. Although we have programmatically defined recrudescence, are we set to effectively measure it? Is the 2-year between impact and surveillance survey sufficient to detect recrudescence? Is TF greater than 5% at surveillance survey an indication of real disease recrudescence, or is it actually missed persistence from the previous impact survey? And going into the future, how sure are we that recrudescence is really unlikely if TF is less than 5% at the surveillance survey? I share these perspectives, these provocative thoughts, to hopefully encourage us to continue to question long-standing assumptions, to buttress or to refute them with data, all with the goal of stabilizing our collective progress. Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Mosier, and in 2020, myself, Dr. Jeremiah Ngandi with RTI International, and Stephanie Palmer with FHI 360, we were searching for a way to articulate our concern that a few but growing number of endemic districts were not responding as anticipated to the standard guidelines, despite following that core NTD meeting, energy seemed to be galvanized. The global community reviewed and defined what non-progressing or non-responding districts were and brought targeted attention to less stable assumptions through the outputs of the WHO informal consultation in late 2022. Ministries of health can now explore modified MDA strategies that will permit them to go beyond the original assumptions of a prescriptive fit between TF prevalences and rounds of MDA. Ministries of health are also strategically deploying the use of supervision coverage tools. Finally, ministries of health are also considering adaptive methods for impact and surveillance surveys to expand their abilities to capture program progress where populations are in flux. They are also considering the inclusion of additional indicators like serological. Regardless of our role, implementing partner, researcher, donor.
All right. Eric, you wanted more time. You got more time. Great. I just want to thank again all the presenters. Thanks all the participants for listening so closely. Jeremiah, if you want to come off mute again, it is now time for the Q&A. I didn't see that there were any questions placed in the chat during the presentations. So if people have questions now, please raise your hand. And then we'll call on you. And additionally, please, if you've got other questions, go ahead and place them in the chat as well.
This is Angelia. And I'm with Zainab here in Khartoum, so our internet is a bit in and out. I had a question for Clara. With looking at, and maybe I missed this, when you kind of use geospatial in order to look where your clustering of your sort of your villages are, and Zainab and I were talking about this is something we might be interested in Sudan with areas that are just very persistent. Is it that it's, I guess, what's the balance between sort of redrawing the EUs to get what you want, or kind of re-looking at it just to better understand the dynamics?
I think that's a great question, Angelina, and I think it depends on the context, obviously, and kind of some of the historical components, and it's really where you want to bring in all the data and country information that you have to be able to think through what makes the most sense and what's possible in your scenario. I think obviously the approach one that I presented is somewhat simplistic and not probably the best approach, given that you are sort of just splitting your prevalence up and might just be making it so that your EUs can both pass, but ultimately you still had a high prevalence in an area. So you do want to look at sort of various options and consider. However, in certain scenarios, you do really have a clustering and a high prevalence in one area compared to the rest of the EU. And in that case, that might make sense to split it and focus your energies and time on a subcomponent of the EU. But I think something to be further discussed in our breakout groups. Great, thank you.
We've got more questions from in the chat. George Cabona, there's a question for you. How do you define enhanced supervision? Can you give an example or three? Over to you, Dr. Cabona. George, are you in the room? Dr. Cabona, could you unmute yourself, please? Okay, well, we're waiting for Dr. Cabona to come online. Clara, we have a question for you as well from the chat. Which measure of coverage do you think would work best for your models?
Thanks.
And relates to some of the analysis that we had done earlier, where coverage seems to show some inconsistency in terms of how you explore the level of coverage and the effect.
Yeah, thanks, Scott, for the question, and Jeremiah. I think this is a great question, and it's part of what is still being explored in this research. I think we all sometimes have some questions about coverage data and the actual level of coverage. So mostly we're looking at rounds of coverage as kind of a proxy of just the treatment level. But depending on the type of coverage data that might be available, if it is more reliable, or if there's maybe been other surveys that validate it, that could be used as a raw data point.
Okay, Dr. Cabona, are you online? Okay, any more questions? You can either raise your hand or type it on the chat, please. Seems like we've reached saturation in terms of the Q&A. And Stephanie, over to you. Oh, I think that there's one more.
Yep.
This is from Tara, thanking the presenters, and she's wondering, in consideration of the alternative MD approaches, was there a thought given to understanding the social context that makes these communities challenging? Indeed, that's, I think, a very good question, and probably that's going to make some very, very, very good ingredient for the conversations that we're going to be holding next, because really the next level of conversion is then what OR do we need to have on board to make sure that what we are putting in place is actually giving us results rather than doing more of the same. Then is there any other? No, I think we are done.
Yes, Jeremiah.
Oh, yes, George, welcome.
Sorry,
There was
there was
a question for you.
Yes, on enhanced supervision.
Yes, please go ahead and define it and
On
give
the
an
chart.
example.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that good question. We enhanced supervision. We mean we are strengthening the supervision by deploying more supervisors down to sub-district level, and also engaging some community supervisors from the communities. And so that means the numbers has increased, and we have reduced the area of supervision. And apart from that, we have also introduced the supervisor coverage tool, which we were not using previously, and also introduced the electronic data capture, time reporting, where those supervisors within the sub-districts, once they receive the reports, they immediately act to the communities where we think the MDA is not catching up with the targets. In short, that's what we mean by enhanced supervision.
Great, thank you, George. Then there's one more question for Diana in the chat, asking about the infection data, which was quite interesting, especially for the persistent EU. And the question is, do you have a sense as to how this data might be used, given that at present there are not any thresholds developed?
Yeah, that is a great question in terms of both the infection and the serology. You know, as I mentioned very quickly, you have Ben Arnold's group at UCSF, and I think some other groups are looking at doing a meta-analysis of data collected from 15 or more population-based surveys, where all of those indicators were collected to try to understand what those thresholds would be, which is an event that will be in the future once that is decided upon. But so currently, essentially what we're just doing is, meeting with the country partners and the implementing partners to discuss, what like how all the data fit together, and going off from the best estimates that we currently have of both serology and infection thresholds. So yeah, so I don't know if you're in the alternative indicators breakout session, but I assume that would be a topic of discussion in there, as well as like where we stand with that and the directions we're going. But yeah, it is one of the challenges right now, is like, trying to understand like what those thresholds would be for the indicators that don't have those set currently.
Thank you, Diana. And Dr. Kabona, I don't know whether we still have you, but going back to Tara's question, which I think is very pertinent to Tanzania, have you given any thought to understanding the social context that makes implementation of public health interventions in some of these communities really challenging?
Sorry, Jeremiah.
Question
is it on the chat?
Yeah, there's a question on the chat from Tara, which is asking regarding the alternative MDA approaches, have you given thought to understanding the social context that makes these communities challenging?
Yes, Jeremiah, we have really taken consideration of that, and we know the remaining communities in Tanzania, as I said, is more of nomadic, mobile migrant population, which is the social cultural context is key in determining whether it contributes a lot on these persistent or reproducing infection. So we have taken steps. We have introduced the behavioral change communication strategy, which is tailored to these nomadic population, particularly the Maasai. But again, we are currently developing, updating it to include all the pastoralists and nomadics across the 10 districts. And apart from that, we have also the enhanced coverage evaluation surveys, which also take some qualitative insights when we are implementing, and also trying to address the social context of which contribute to the uptake of the MDA, including other entity interventions. So that's what we are taking it into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kabona. Stephanie, over to you. There's one more question which I think we'll push to the serology group. Over to you, Stephanie.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, Emma, we saw your question, and I think that's definitely something to discuss. I believe you're in the breakout group with Diana, so you can further discuss that. So we are going to break into our breakout groups. We'll be there for approximately 30 minutes, although we're 5 minutes behind, so I guess it'll be about 25 minutes in the breakout groups. Please make sure you have gotten into the Jamboard, so find where Eric has pasted that link and paste it into your browser. It will take a few seconds to get into the breakout groups, and then we'll come back for about 5 to 10 minutes at the end to report back on some of the most important points that your group discussed. Kristen,
I'm back. I think people are still trickling in from the breakout session. I hope you had engaging conversations. The breakout rooms were much less. We had much fewer people than I'd imagined. I was expecting 30 in my group, and we were only 5. But then I think we had some very good discussions. Kelly, I see your hand is up. You have a question already, or you reporting for your group?
No, thank you, Dr. Jeremiah Ngundy. Nice to see you, Dr. Hari. Can you put the link to the Jamboard back in the chat? I think we've restarted and lost the ability to check the link. Thanks. Nice to see you.
I'm going to do that immediately. There you are, and thank you for reminding us to do that. Okay, so let's go to the reporting. Group 1. Who's reporting for Group 1? Diana's group, that is.
Who's reporting? I'll report from my.
Okay, lovely. Go ahead.
Not sure what to report back. Yeah, we had about 8 people and a number of comments in the board about, about community engagement throughout this whole process, which is part of that whole guideline development process. Understanding like the planning and logistics of adding indicators, the timing of doing it, if is it like that it's better to do it as part of programmatic activities than to do an impact survey, see that impact survey is above 5%, and then decide, oh, we need to go do another survey with additional indicators. So anticipating that, there's a big discussion around recognizing that the differences in districts with persistent and recrudescent TF, that those might not all be the same, and the importance of tailoring. I think that was a really useful outcome of the Trachoma Endgame meeting, is recognizing that that those that doing the same thing for each of those places is not really useful, in trying to identify both in terms like the causes of persistence and recrudescence, like understanding what's happening there, and especially thinking then very long term for post-validation surveillance, and then trying to identify, because of the importance for integrating with the NTD roadmap pillars, and just the practicalities, like the importance of identifying platforms for potentially integrating trachoma surveillance with other disease programs.
Thank you, Diana. Group 2, I think, Christine, you're reporting on behalf of our group?
Yes, thanks, Jeremiah. So just trying to summarize a very rich conversation we had. There were really kind of 2 broad topics. So first was specific populations, in particular cross-border pastoral populations such as the Maasai. We need to understand what are their migration patterns and how is the migration determined each year. Attention is needed to non-adherers, especially in this population. And then we also discussed Ethiopia. So Ethiopia is doing child-only NDA in 4 to 6 weeks after the main NDA. So there's lots of OR questions around the effectiveness of this strategy. And then kind of more general OR questions we came up with was a need to adapt a cost-effective microplanning NDA strategy. What is the unit cost of enhanced NDA? That's very important. How can we get the correct populations? Coverage is so unreliable. How can we improve this? We need to understand zero dose populations. So who is missing every round and why? And then we also need to understand if synchronous MDA across borders has increased coverage. Can we learn from other disease programs in this area? And then finally, we all, I think, agree that alternative indicators are needed to better understand persistence and recrudescence. But of course, this adds to the complexity. So looking forward to hearing about the other breakout sessions as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Christine. Over to group 3. So Clara, who's reporting for your group?
Yeah, I'll be reporting for our group. We also had a great conversation in our small group. I think one of the big themes was around population movement, but both at kind of a larger scale of, between borders, between countries, and how we might think about that in the geospatial space, but also on a quite micro scale around the kind of movement within a day and how we might be missing people on MDA at that time. A few suggestions that were interesting that we want to consider moving forward was potentially the use or creation of a decision tree to help in programs and countries kind of think through how to use some of these new tools, and also the support and use of possibly kind of district or sub-district risk profile kind of documentation to be used as part of a larger conversation around micro-planning and programmatic needs at a very small scale. So yeah, lots of great conversations in our spatial group. Thanks.
Thank you, Clara. Group 4, Eric, who's reporting for your group?
Yes, thank you. We had, of course, there was far too time to really get into many details, but a few of the things that came up were perhaps additional OR around the value and the contribution of F&E to progress. We talked about the cost and facility of use and the feasibility of more frequent than annual MDA and its efficacy. We had a throw question over to the serology group that we were not able to address, and it was just the going to scale availability of guidelines and how would those go? How would one be able to cost that? Because there's a lot of parts that have to be purchased, and how could you take the guidelines and bring it to a programmatic reality for national programs? And then what we spent, there was also on the statistical implications of results and whether a pass is a true pass or is a fail a true fail, and being able to have programs to make better decisions or have complementary information when you're within that confidence interval or the error of the margin of error. And then what we spent an important amount of time is, because of its relative importance to program measurement coverage, was a big conversation, and about whether there are sufficient or adequate tools to adequately and accurately measure coverage. Coverage plays a strong role in measuring the drug donation program, how resources are being spent. So what further needs to happen in that space to try to provide the tools to programs to know to the degree to which populations have received the drug, and whether that is the best measure of progress on the program. So those were some of the things. Stephanie, did I miss anything that you thought also was important?
No, I think you captured a lot of that.
Okay,
Good.
thank you.
Thank you, rapporteurs, and over to you, Stephanie.
Well, we're at the end of the session. I really want to thank all of our presenters once again. I think you provided a lot of information to have rich conversations. Unfortunately, we had a very limited time. So I know that some groups just didn't quite get where they wanted to, but I know that these discussions will continue. I really want to thank all the participants for their active participation. I think when you throw out new ideas to us, I think that's helpful for us to hear. So just want to thank everyone, and then thank all of those from the NTD Support Center as well for all their support in putting up the presentations, in managing time, and everything else. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.